Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
So let's move on to the first topic. Here we'll try to understand why and how the partition took place. Okay. Now many historians, they are of the opinion, they say that prominent Muslim leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah's theory that Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations, or that theory was also called two nations theory, can be found into the history of medieval India. So most of the historians, they believe that the partition took place because of the two-nation theory which was advocated by the Muslim leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And by this theory, he said that Hindus and Muslims need to be in two separate nations. Okay, they cannot live in one unified country. They have to live in two separate nations. Alright, so they say that this led to partition. And this theory, okay, of Jinnah, of how the two cannot live together, two nation theory, the two communities cannot live together, this goes on to the history of medieval India. So meaning that this two nation theory goes back in time. Okay, this kind of theory was present in the medieval time as well. And they argue that the events of 1947 were intimately connected with long history of Hindu-Muslim conflict throughout medieval and modern times. And they say that the partition is connected to the Hindu-Muslim conflict which existed in the medieval period as well as in the early modern period. Okay, so that conflict between the two has gone to forming a theory called two-nation theory by the Muslim leader, and that went on to the partition of India. Okay. Now these historians, they fail to recognize the fact that the conflict between communities has coexisted with a long history of sharing power and of mutual cultural exchanges. Now, these historians who only focus on the conflict between Hindus and Muslims and how that led or that caused the partition of India, they have failed to see or to show that how these conflicts between communities have always existed. So that was one kind of historian. Another kind of historians see partition as a culmination of communal politics that began to develop in the early years of the 20th century. Now, another group of historians, they say that partition happened as a result of communal politics of the two different communities which developed in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, now what was this communal politics? Now, according to the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, which was introduced by the British government, a separate electorate for Muslims were provided. Okay, and separate electorate was also provided to other communities, not only Muslims but other communities, by the Government of India Act of 1990. Now, this provision of separate electorate to Muslims and other communities, this shaped the nature of communal politics. That's what the historians say. Okay. Now, what do we understand by separate electorate? So, when we say separate electorate, it means that now Muslims could elect their own representatives in the constituencies reserved for them. So there would be districts or constituencies, areas where they had reservations. Okay, so in that constituency, say for example, one seat was reserved for a Muslim candidate. Okay, so the Muslim could now elect their own representative in that constituency. So that is separate electorate. So Muslims could now enjoy that privilege. They could elect their own representatives. Okay, so historians are of the opinion that this provision of separate electorate by the British government gave rise to communal politics. Okay. Now the Muslims, what they did was they raised sectarian slogan and gathered supporters by distributing favors to their own religious groups. So this allowed the separate electorate allowed, say for example, the Muslims to garner support from their Muslim community members, okay, and to also give them favors so that their support does not fail, and also only give favors to only those people who belong to their religious group, who belong to the religious community, which is the Muslims who follow Islam, okay, and not others. They would not give favors to others. So that sort of gave rise to communal politics, okay. So this meant when a community, a Muslim community, only works for its community members who are only Muslims, who are only followers of Islam and not others, then what that leads to? That leads to opposition and hostility between two different or other communities. If you are only working towards garnering support from only your community members, if you're only providing favors to only people who are followers of Islam because your community is Muslim, right, and others you're not trying to include, so that gives a sense that you are now only focusing on your community, the religion that the community follows, and then this brings you in opposition, in hostile environment with the other communities. Obviously there will be tension between one community working towards its own favors against another one, okay. So this separate electorate system, okay, this many historians believe had deep impact in the Indian politics during the first half of the 20th century, okay. But despite that fact, despite the historians bringing out this a separate electorate system as one of the causes of partition, but we cannot suggest that partition was solely as a result of the separate electorate system, okay, because during that time and after that time, after the provision of separate electorate, there were many other developments, okay, many other events that took place in the early 20th century, and these events, they consolidated the communal identities, they strengthened the communal identities of different communities, like the Muslim identities, Hindu identities, right? And between 1920s and 1930s, tensions increased further, deeper between the communities. The Muslims did not like the music before mosques, the cow protection laws of the government, the efforts of Arya Samaj to bring back to Hindu religion, which they call Suddhi, of those who had recently embraced Islam. So if any Hindus who were converted to Islam, then the Arya Samaj would then help this newly converted person back to Hinduism, to Hindu religion. Okay, so these practices and attitudes of the Hindus and the government was not liked by the Muslims, and they were angry at them. Okay. Now the Hindus simultaneously were also angry by the spread of Tabligh propaganda by this organization or Tanzim by Muslim ulema after 1923. So the Hindus were also not happy with the Muslim attitude, okay, and the development within their communities. So as a result of the tension developing over a period of time, there were outbreak of riots, outbreak of conflicts between communities, Hindus and Muslims in different parts of the country. Okay, so these riots, these conflicts, they further deepened the differences, they further deepened the gulf, okay, the divide which the Muslims and Hindus already had. Okay. Now, despite all these communal tensions, developments, the separate electorate, the two nations theory, It is incorrect for us to see partition of the country as a result of a simple unfolding of communal tensions. It will be wrong for us to say that partition took place, partition occurred as a result of the communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims. Okay? Partition of the country was a qualitatively different event from earlier communal disturbances. It was completely different from the communal disturbances, the communal conflicts, the communal hostilities. Okay, so how can we better understand that partition was not the product, not the outcome of communal conflicts, communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims, is that we have to study all the events that led to partition, all the events before partition, so that we have an overall understanding of how the partition took place. Okay, how India arrived at a point where they had to have a partition, where a new state of Pakistan had to be created. All right. So we'll look at the election of 1937 and the Congress ministers and the other events which took place after that. Okay. So in 1937, there was an election. Okay, there was an election. Now, the Congress and the other political parties like the Muslim League, they participated in this election. Okay, election that took place in 1937. Now, in this election, the Congress party came victorious. They had contested for 1,161 seats and they secured 715 seats. Alright, and out of 11 provinces in India, they gained majority. The party gained majority in 7. Alright. Now, the Muslim League, another important party, could only secure 4.4% of the total Muslim votes. So, out of all the Muslim votes, only 4.4% were given to the Muslim League. Okay. Now, after the elections, the Congress had won, right? They had acquired majority. So, they had to form ministries, alright, ministries in provinces for its administration. Now, when the question of forming ministries came, there was divided opinion. Okay, some were okay with it, some were not okay with it. Alright. Now, large section of people led by Jawaharlal Nehru was against it, against forming ministries of the Congress. Okay. Now, others were in disagreement with Nehru. Alright, so finally a solution was brought out by Mahatma Gandhi, and he said that the Congress should form ministries in those provinces where the party leader could state publicly that the governor would not use his special powers in day-to-day administration of the province and would not act on the advice of the ministers and would act on the advice of the ministers in all matters. So basically, Mahatma Gandhi was suggesting that the Congress should form ministries in those provinces where they could work with the governor of that province, the British governor of that province, where the governor would not use his special powers in interfering in the day-to-day running of the administration, and where the Indian ministers would advise and work together hand in hand with the governor of the province. This is what Mahatma Gandhi suggested. Okay, but obviously this suggestion was not liked by the governors of the provinces, so the British governors refused it. The British government refused this suggestion. Okay, and the Viceroy of India stated that the Act of 1935, okay, which according to which act the election of 1937 had taken place, this act had called for cooperation between governors and the ministers. Alright, so they said, the Viceroy said that the governors and the ministers are supposed to cooperate with each other and work together. But they were clearly not ready to cooperate, right? So, because the governors refused the suggestion provided by Mahatma Gandhi. So, this caused disappointment among the Congress. The Congress did not like what the government had to say. Now, anyway, the Congress formed ministries in 7 provinces in October 1937 and in Assam in 1938. In the remaining 3 provinces, coalition governments were formed. Coalition means 2 governments together. So the Indian and the British. Both officers and ministers came together to form the government. Okay. Now, after that, another incident that took place was the Second World War. So let's see how that impacted the developments of the Congress. Okay. Now, the Congress ministries, after they were formed, they tried very hard. They made very good efforts to improve or to bring improvements in the provinces that were under their control, under their power. Okay. So as they were doing that, in September 1939, Second World War broke out. Okay. And Great Britain entered the war. Alright. Now, as Great Britain entered the war, India was dragged into the war because India was part of the British Empire, right? So, India was made to enter the war by the Viceroy, but without consulting the leaders or legislatures in India, without any consultation with the Indian leaders, the nationalist leaders or the Congress leaders, India was dragged into the war. Now, this was not accepted by the Indian leaders and they resented it. They said that India could not take part in a war when its freedom was denied to her. When India was not free, how can it take part in the war? Okay, so the Congress leaders, they refused to participate in the conflict unless India's right to freedom was acknowledged and the Indians were allowed to shape their own future through a duly elected constituent assembly. So the Indian leaders, what they did, we will not take part and help you in the war until and unless you give us complete freedom and until and unless you allow to shape our own future. Okay, you allow us to build our own constituent assembly, our constitution, etc. to help us control our nation, our people, and bring improvements ourselves. That's what they said. Okay, but the British government, of course, did not accept this demand of the Congress. All right. And the government suggested that the constitutional scheme would be reopened and re-examined after the war. So the government said, wait until the war. After the war, a constitutional scheme would be reopened to re-examine the suggestions and problems that the Indians were facing and the demands that they were raising. Now, this was not to the Congress's satisfaction. They were not satisfied with this suggestion. Okay. So the Congress Working Party, they met at Wardha and they called upon all the Congress ministers to dissociate themselves from the government and to give their resignations. So this is a way of protest. Okay, so they resigned from their positions. Such resignations were encouraged by the Congress leaders to tell the British government that they were not happy with the suggestions and they would not take part in the war until and unless freedom was given to them. Okay. Now, when this happened, when the Congress began to resign from the ministries, then Jinnah called upon the Indian Muslims to celebrate the departure of the Congress ministers, and he called it as a day of deliverance from the tyranny and injustice, a day of the injustice of the Congress rule. Okay, so while the Congress was expressing dissatisfaction, expressing resent, Jinnah and the Muslim League, they were celebrating the departure of the Congress ministers who were resigning. Okay. Now, the British government took advantage of the situation, how the Congress was were dissociating from the government and how the Muslim League was coming closer and supporting the British government. Okay, so they took advantage of this situation and they adopted a policy to pamper or to appease the Muslim League and Jinnah at the cost of Congress. So now they began to support and give favors to the Muslim League at the cost of Congress. Okay. Now in the election, we know that the Congress won majority, right? But they could not win most of the seats that were reserved for the minorities. Now Muslims were also one of the minorities. Okay. The Muslims could only secure 26 seats out of 482 seats that were reserved for the Muslims. Okay. Now the Muslim League led by Mr. Jinnah was the leader of the Muslim League, and they took full advantage of the situation where the Congress did not win the minority seats. Okay. So they raised slogans and cries that Congress was a Hindu organization. Okay, it was not inclusive organization where other communities also were present. It was a Hindu organization, and they began to develop a theory, okay, of two nations, which meant that Hindu and Muslim were two separate nations and therefore could not live together. So this is what the Muslim League came up with. Okay, and in 1940. At the Lahore session of Muslim League, they passed a resolution, and that resolution demanded the partition of the country and creation of a separate homeland for the Muslim, which was called Pakistan. So this happened in 1940, okay, in Lahore. Now this idea of separate Muslim homeland, okay, the idea of Pakistan was propagated not by Jinnah. Okay, it was first propagated by someone called Chaudhary Rahmat Ali in 1933. Okay, and he said that Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Jammu and Kashmir should be formed into a separate Muslim state. That was what he suggested. However, these provinces were to remain in the Indian Dominion, but Rahmat Ali did not advocate the idea that this new state, Pakistan, which was to be the homeland consisting of Punjab, Northwestern Frontier and Jammu and Kashmir and Sindh, this was not to be separated from the Indian Dominion. This was to be part of India, okay, remain inside India, but form a separate homeland, Pakistan, okay. But the difference between Rahmat Ali and Jinnah is that Jinnah said the same thing, but in addition to that, he demanded that these provinces or Pakistan, the newly created Pakistan, a separate homeland for Muslims, they should be completely independent. They should be free from the state of India. Now, in 1940, Britain was already in the war, right, in the Second World War, and their position began to deteriorate. Their position began to become weak. Okay, now they were desperately in need of help from the Indian people. All right, so the British government appealed to the people of India. And on June 1st, Mahatma Gandhi offered to help the government, but under two conditions. Okay, so when the British government requested the Indian leaders to help the British government in its war efforts in Germany, in Europe, then Indian leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi said, okay, we will help you, but there are two conditions fulfilling which we will provide our help. First, independence was to be declared. Okay, Indians want independence. And second, a provisional government comprising of various parties were to be set up in the country. Okay, so first independence and second provisional government to be set up. Alright. Now, in August 1940, after Mahatma Gandhi gave his recommendations, in August 1940, Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy of India, after consultation with all the political parties in India on behalf of the British government, he issued a statement. Okay, he came up with a statement, and that statement came to be called August Offer. So the British government heard the demands made by Mahatma Gandhi on behalf of Congress. Now, after deliberation, after discussion, the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, came up with a statement, what the British government had to offer, and that was called August Offer. So the main features, what did this offer say? The main features of this offer was establishment of full-fledged responsible government in India on dominion model after the termination of war. So after the war, a responsible government would be set up in India. Okay. And second, establish a war advisory council in which certain number of Indian representatives will be invited to join. Second was establishment of a war advisory council. And third, incorporation of some Indians into the Viceroy's Executive Council. So these were the three main provisions of the statement provided by the statement. Okay, but this was not enough. The statement, the offer made by the British government was not enough, and the Congress rejected this offer because it made mere promises. It only made simply promises of some concessions. There were no active action being taken. Alright, and it also gave wicked promises to the minorities. Alright, and soon after this, after the Congress was not happy with it, Mahatma Gandhi started something called individual satyagraha. Okay, it was a form of a protest against the British government. Now, what is individual satyagraha? Individual satyagraha is a moral protest against the British attitude towards the Indians. Alright? Now, according to it, men and women were to protest individually against dragging India into the war and the governmental attack on the right of speech. Okay, so the British government was dragging India to war, and it was also attacking the Indians' right to speech. So, Mahatma Gandhi said or encouraged men and women of India to take upon individual satyagraha to protest against these things, these attitudes adopted by the British government. Okay, they were to dissociate themselves from the war effort. India now wanted to dissociate. Okay, take themselves out from the British war effort. Now, the first individual satyagrahi was Vinoba Bhave. Okay. Now, during this individual satyagraha, about 30,000 men were arrested. Alright. Now, we have to understand that while this was happening in India, the Second World War is going on. Okay. Now, in December 7th, 1941, Japan entered Second World War. Okay. Now, with the entry of Japan, India was in immediate danger. Okay. Now we'll see why. Now, the working committee of the Congress felt great concern over this turn of event, the entry of Japan in the war. Okay. So they decided to suspend the individual satyagraha. Alright. Now, by the end of 1941, the war spread to Southeast Asia. So, with the entry of Japan in the war, now the Second World War, which was being fought in the European front, came to Asia. Okay, there was another front in Asia. Okay, so now the war spread to Southeast Asia. Okay, and from Southeast Asia now, Japan invaded Burma and occupied Rangoon, its capital, in March 8, 1942. Okay, now Burma is at the border, along the border, is a neighbor to British India, right? So when Japan arrived in Burma, the British government now panicked. Okay, now it desperately needed the cooperation of Indians in the war efforts. Okay. So on 23rd March 1942, the British government sent a mission under Sir Stafford Cripps to India. Okay, and this mission made few suggestions. Now the suggestions were that India would be offered dominion status after the war. Constitution making body would also be set up to frame a new constitution of India. Provinces and the Indian states which were not prepared to accept the new constitution would form a separate union. Okay. In the interim period, before that happens, the British government would retain control of the defense of India and others were to be controlled by the Indian representatives. The Indians were to fully cooperate with the British government in fighting the war in the Second World War. Okay, so these were the suggestions made by the Cripps mission. So in this mission and the statement of or the provisions of this mission, what we can see is that the British government made serious attempt to satisfy the different political parties of India. It tried to satisfy the Congress as well as the Muslim League. Okay. Now, however, the Congress and the other political parties rejected this proposal as well. Okay. Now, this proposal, what it did was it sowed the seeds of partition of India. Okay. So this is one of the main effect of the proposal. Now, the Muslim League became very demanding for the creation of a separate state for themselves, which is Pakistan. Okay. Because the proposal, as you can already see, it said that the provinces and the Indian states which are not prepared to accept the new constitution of India, they could form a separate union, which means that if a province did not want to be part of a union of everyone coming together, then they could also form a separate union. So that allows the Muslim League to make their demand even more louder. Okay, demand for a separate state. Alright, because they don't want to be part of the union, they want to form a separate state. Okay. Now, the failure of Cripps' mission led to widespread disappointment and anger in the country. Okay, people were angry, people were not satisfied with the British government and what they had to offer. They despised their attitude towards India and Indians. Okay. Now, the Congress decided to intensify their struggle against the British to compel them to accept the Indian demand for independence. Now, the Congress decided that it was time for them to intensify their struggle for freedom to make sure that the British government gave independence. Okay, that the British government left India and accept India's independence. Okay. Now, the Congress decided to finally help the British in Second World War if on a condition that freedom was granted to India immediately. Okay, so that was their condition. The All India Congress Working Committee met at Bombay in August 7, 1942 under the presidentship of Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad. Okay, so this is what happened. And finally, the Congress passed the Quit India resolution and decided to launch a mass non-violent struggle to achieve independence under Gandhiji's leadership. So their aim to intensify the movement against the British for freedom, they passed Quit India resolution and they launched a mass non-violent struggle for the fight for India's independence under the leadership of Gandhiji. But before the movement could even start, Gandhiji and many other prominent Congress leaders were arrested by the British government. Okay, the British government declared Congress as unlawful association, unlawful body. Okay. Now, when this happened, when the British government and its officials were arresting the leaders and putting them to jail, people now became extremely angry and they adopted extreme measures. Okay, now they were not non-violent. They could even use violence in their fight. Okay, so there were protest demonstrations, hartals, strikes or bunds in factories, schools and colleges all over the country. So people all across the country now came together. They marched on the streets demonstrating their protest. They called for strikes, hartals. They shut down schools, colleges, offices, etc. Okay, and the movement very soon took a violent form. It was non-violent when it began, right? The idea was for the movement to be non-violent, but with how the British were dealing with the leaders of the Indian National Congress, the people could not take it anymore and they took the form of a violent outbreak. Okay, the movement turned violent. Now, what the people did, the people now cut telegraph wires, they damaged railway lines, they burned government buildings and other properties, etc. Okay. Over 250 railway stations and 500 offices were damaged. Over 150 police stations were raided and destroyed by the people. Okay. Now, when this happened, the British government became extremely determined to crush the movement as quickly as possible. They were dealing with the Second World War. Now, at home, like in India, they had to deal with the uprising, the mass uprising, right? The mass protest. So this had to be dealt with extremely quickly. Okay, as quickly as possible. And the government was determined to crush it. So the government resorted to machine guns, aerial firing. So the government now did not hesitate to use guns, machine guns, aerial guns, and shot at the people. Okay? The military took over many towns and cities across India. People were imprisoned and they were tortured when they were in prison. Over 10,000 people were killed in police and military firing. So you can see a huge number of people lost their lives. Okay? The movement was crushed in 3 months. The entire Quit India movement was crushed in 3 months and the movement hence failed. But even despite the movement failing, the national feelings among the people, the feeling to continue the fight against the British for India's freedom, that actually heightened, that had escalated among the people. Now people could not be stopped in their fight for freedom. Okay. In March 1940, the Muslim League had passed the resolution for creation of a separate state of Pakistan. Raja Gopal Acharya, a prominent Congress leader, offered a proposal for compromise between the Congress and the Muslim League. Now, when the Muslim League proposed for a creation of a separate homeland for Muslims, Pakistan, in 1940, the Congress did not like this idea. So, the prominent Congress leader Raja Gopal Acharya sought to find compromises between the two, so that the Muslim League do not demand or continue a demand for a separate state. Alright? But Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the leader of the Muslim League, refused to accept this effort of compromise and the proposal of the Congress leader. Alright, so that attempt by the Congress also failed. Alright. In 1945, Lord Wavell, the Viceroy of India, after consultations with the British government, formulated a proposal to solve the Indian political problem. So you see, there was a political standstill in India in 1945, and this had to be, there needed a solution, something had to be done. So Lord Wavell brought out a proposal in 1945, and that's called Wavell Plan. Now what did it propose? Let's look at it. The first is that reconstitution of Viceroy's Executive Council pending the preparation of the new Constitution of India. So it suggested reconstitution of the Viceroy's Executive Council. The second, all members of the Executive Council of the Governor General except the Commander-in-Chief were to be nominated from amongst the Indian leaders. Okay? Every member in the Governor General's Council would be Indian leaders except the Commander-in-Chief, who would be a European or a British official. Number 3, equal representation were to be provided to both the Hindus and the Muslim communities. Okay. Number 4, external affairs was to be transferred from Governor General to an Indian Minister of the Council. Okay. And 5th, establishment of responsible government in the provinces. So these were the main plans or suggestions or proposals made by Babur through his proposal. Okay. Now after this was made, a conference was called in Shimla. Okay, conference between the British government representatives, the Congress, the Muslim League and other Indian parties. And in this conference, what was done? They discussed the formation of coalition government at the center, a government which was to be formed by both the British as well as the Indian political leaders, okay, together. Now, the Muslim League did not approve the nomination of the nationalist Muslim in the new Executive Council by the Congress. Now, while they were discussing the formation of coalition government, it means that the British would have their representatives. From the Indian political parties, the Congress would have their representatives, the Muslim League would have their representatives. Now, when the Congress were suggesting some Muslim representatives, the Muslim League did not approve of those representatives because they suggested that only those should be nominated who were Muslims approved by the Muslim League themselves. So basically they were saying that the Congress would not be allowed, Congress should not nominate the Muslims. The Muslim League will nominate the Muslim representatives. Okay. Now this was again not accepted by the Congress. So because of the conflict in interest of the Congress as well as the Muslim League, this conference also ended in a failure in June 14, 1945. Okay. Now another major development of this period was the formation and activities of the INA or the Indian National Army. Okay. Now Rash Bihari Bose was the first to think of forming such an army such as INA or the Indian National Army. Okay. Now Bose was an Indian revolutionary. He was also freedom fighter, an Indian revolutionary who fought for India's independence against the British. He escaped from India and lived in Japan for many years. Okay, and he set up Indian Independence League with the support of the Indians living in the Southeast Asia. Okay. Now, during the Second World War, many Indian soldiers were taken prisoners by the Japanese. So many Indians who were in the British military service or the British army and who were fighting against the British enemies who are the Japanese. So as they were fighting and then when they would lose and when they had to surrender, then the Japanese took many Indian soldiers as prisoners of war. Now the Indian Independence League formed by Bose set up the Indian National Army among the Indian prisoners of war. So these prisoners, Indian prisoners of war who were taken by the Japanese, they were then brought by Bose to form the Indian National Army. Now the main aim or the objective of the Indian National Army was to liberate India from the foreign rule. Their aim was to free India from British rule. And so they thought that if they join the enemies, if they join the enemy's army, right? If they take support of Japan, if they take support of the Japanese troops and then fight against the British, then they thought that that is how they would acquire freedom, because Japanese troops were also fighting against the British. So both the Indian National Army and the Japanese had the same or common enemy, who was the British. Okay. Now, another important role or another person apart from Bose who played an important role in the INA and who was a member of the British Indian Army, he was General Mohan Singh. Okay. Now, when we talk about Indian National Army, then the first thing that comes to our mind is Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And now we are going to look at his role in the Indian national movement and in the formation of Indian National Army. Now, India's freedom struggle found a new expression due to efforts of Subhash Chandra Bose. Subhash Chandra Bose played an important role or key role in the India's freedom struggle against the British. Okay. In 1941, Subhash Chandra Bose escaped from India and somehow managed to reach Germany, and then soon he reached Russia. In February 1943, he went to Japan to organize an armed struggle against the British rule with the help of the Japanese. So he went to Japan to seek their support in his fight against the British. Okay? He did not have faith in Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent methods. He did not believe that non-violent methods or by adopting non-violence one could get freedom. Okay. He was also the president of the Congress, but he resigned from the presidentship, the post of president, and he formed a separate party whose name was the Forward Bloc. Okay. With the help of the Japanese, he organized the Azad Hind Fauj, or the Indian National Army, in Singapore to conduct a military campaign on liberation of India. So he took the help of the Japanese troops or Japan, and he organized the Azad Hind Fauj or Indian National Army in Singapore to fight against the British. Alright. Before the arrival of Subhash Chandra Bose, steps towards organization of INA had already been taken by Captain Mohan Singh. So Captain Mohan Singh, which was another INA member, and he had already been taken certain steps before Subhash Chandra Bose arrived for the organization of Indian National Army. Okay. Now, INA, Indian National Army, was joined by many Indians who lived in Southeast Asia and by Indian soldiers and officers who had been prisoners of war of the Japanese in Malaya, Burma and Singapore. So, INA had Indians who were prisoners of war of the Japanese and also Indian soldiers and officers who came to be left the service and came to be a part of INA. Okay. Now the INA joins the Japanese army in its invasion of India from Burma against the British. Like I said, the INA's main object was to fight the British and to acquire freedom. Right? Now by seeking or by fighting alongside the British and seeking its support, they were fighting against common enemy. Both of the parties' enemy was the British. Okay, so they fought alongside the Japanese army and invaded Burma against the British. In October 21, 1943, he issued a historic proclamation forming the Provisional Government of India. So, Subhash Chandra Bose in 1943 issued a historic proclamation forming the Provisional Government of India. He afterwards led the INA or the Indian National Army on the Burma front to recover the independence of India from the eastern side. So, I already told you that Subhash Chandra Bose led the troops with the Japanese troops in its fight against the British from the eastern side, okay, from Burma. He advanced as far as Kohima in Nagaland and Moirang in Manipur. So he entered in Nagaland and Moirang. But by then, Japan had been defeated and was no longer in position to help the INA or Subhash Chandra Bose. Okay. So Japan was finally defeated in the war or Second World War, and with that the fate of the Indian National Army or Subhash Chandra Bose also changed. Now soon after, Subhash Chandra Bose was killed in a plane accident while he was on the way to Tokyo. Now, national leaders, the Congress leaders, they did not like the idea of INA joining Japan to win freedom. They were not comfortable with the idea that Indians were joining the Japanese troops in its fight against the British. Okay, but after the war was over, after the Second World War, the Indian nationalist leaders declared INA as example of courage and patriotism. They recognized their effort, their contribution towards the freedom struggle. Okay. Now, after Japan defeated and after Britain became victorious in the Second World War, now all those officials who had left the British service to join the INA and fight against the British troops, they were now brought to trial. Okay, they were, because they had left the British side to join the enemy's side and fight against them, right? So after the war, Generals Shah Nawaz, Gurbakhsh Singh Dhillon, Prem Singh Sehgal, who had left the British Army during the war to join the INA, they were put to trial. Now they were tried at the court. Okay? And why they were tried at the court? Because they had joined the enemy to wage a war against the British Emperor or the British government. Okay? Now when this happened, the Congress took the responsibility of defending the people who were accused, who were being tried. Okay, so they set up a defense committee. They set up a committee to defend these people who were put on trial. Alright, and most of the people in that committee were lawyers. Okay, so some of the members of the committee were Bhulabhai Desai, Tej Bahadur Sapru, Asaf Ali, and Pandit Nehru. Okay. There were, apart from such creation of defense committee, the people all across India, they demanded and protested, demanding the release of the accused accused Indians. Okay, but the court held them guilty and sentenced them to death. All right. Now, after that, there were a lot of protests, mass protests, demonstrations, which came up, which were witnessed. So, the British government got pressure from the people. So, out of this pressure, the government remitted the sentences of the accused and set them free.